Okay, thank you very much. So, how are you? Not too full from lunch, not gonna fall into a food coma, right? I'll keep you awake. So great, I'm so excited to be here. Amazing weather. Actually, this is the first, I just realized right now, this is the first time I'm talking in Prague. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I love standing in front of vegans who inspire me so deeply, who I know are working so hard and often doing such great work to make the world a better place for animals, doing the really hard work that we all need to do in the world, and being able to share good news with you, like the fact that the vegan movement is growing all over the world, which it is, thanks to you. And today I'm going to talk about something else, though, that's growing in our movement. And it's a virus of sorts. It's a virus that is contagious and debilitating and potentially even deadly. And this virus is toxic communication among vegans. Now, before I explain what toxic communication is, I'm just going to give you a few examples of it. And I hope you're seeing the same thing I am. Okay. Can you all read that? You need me to read it for you? Because I don't want to swear on video. Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is not a huge surprise to you. How many of you have witnessed toxic communication among vegans, meaning vegans talking to other vegans? Just curious. So kind of everybody in the room. How many of you who have actually been a target of toxic communication yourself on the receiving end of it? It's a lot of people. It's really painful. It's really painful. And I have too. I have been on the receiving end of this, and it was absolutely devastating for me. I have actually spoken to many, many vegans, some of whom have been brilliant organizational leaders who have shared these deeply painful stories with me of the incredible sense of like betrayal and demoralization they've experienced from being on the receiving end of toxic communication. And in my experience, most vegans who actually end up quitting the movement don't do so because they can't tolerate the pressure of carnistic culture. They do it because of this profound sense of betrayal and demoralization that they experience from toxic interactions and communication with other vegans. This is a serious problem for our movement. And so first, before I talk about how to address it and where it comes from, I'm going to talk about what I mean when I'm talking about when I say toxic communication. So toxic communication is any communication that violates our integrity and harms the dignity of others. Integrity is the integration of core moral values such as compassion and justice and practices. So we practice our integrity, we practice integrity when we practice what we preach. And we violate our integrity whenever we communicate in a way that doesn't reflect compassion and justice or fairness. Dignity is one sense of intrinsic worth. It's the feeling when we feel a sense of dignity, we feel that we are fundamentally worthy as a being on this planet. We don't feel less than others. We feel that we have value in and of who we are. Does that make sense? So we violate or we harm another's dignity whenever we communicate that they are somehow less than, that they're inferior. We harm another's dignity when we shame them. Now, shame is the feeling of being less than. Let me differentiate shame versus guilt so this is really clear. We often use shame and guilt interchangeably, but they're two different words with two different meanings. Does anybody know the difference between shame and guilt? What is it? Sorry, I forgot there was translation here. So what's the difference?
Okay, so shame can be can come from different sources, and guilt can have a real reason okay, well, I did something wrong, and someone told me I did something wrong, and I feel guilt. But if I'm not sure that I did something wrong, and someone told me I did it, I kind of feel ashamed. So there's difference.
Okay, so you're differentiating it between like who it comes from, where the information comes from.
There's a different feeling.
Partly true, but you're right, there's a different feeling, okay? So to differentiate for you, guilt is the feeling we have when we do something bad. Guilt is how we feel about a behavior. We feel guilty when we think, I did something bad. Shame is the feeling we have not about a behavior, but about what? About ourselves. When we feel shame, we think, I am bad. You see the difference? When we feel shame, we feel less than. We feel that we are fundamentally less worthy than others. And shame is an incredibly disruptive and destructive emotion. Most people, because we've been born into a deeply dysfunctional, incredibly non-relational world, where shaming behaviors and attitudes are normal. Most of us carry around a lot of shame. And most of us work pretty hard to hide the shame that we have inside of us. We hide it by, wrapping it underneath, or we bury it underneath our various successes. We hide it underneath being the best activist maybe, or saving the most animals, or looking the best. And we even hide our shame from ourselves, because we often feel ashamed of feeling shame. So very often we don't realize how much shame, how much other people are struggling not to feel ashamed, not to feel like we're not good enough, not to feel like we don't deserve to be on this planet just as much as everybody else does. And we end up triggering shame in others without realizing the damage that we're doing to them. I often say that the best way for us to make somebody do the opposite of what we want is to shame them. Shamed people are not people who feel a sense of agency, ability to take positive action on others or their own behalf. Shamed people want to protect themselves from further shame. They wrap themselves in the emotional armor to protect themselves from being more shamed. So they withdraw or they attack in self-defense. And when you think about communication among vegans or with vegan outreach to non-vegans, do you notice that it can often have a shaming component to it? A lot of our communication is a lot of our outreaches, and we have to be very careful with this. Shame is epidemic. When people feel shame, they often react by shaming others. I feel less than, so in order to feel better, what do? Make somebody else feel less than, and then the cycle repeats itself. And so what we end up doing is creating this shame-based this epidemic of shame. And when people feel shame, studies have shown that they exhibit a stress response. The stress response is when people's dignity is harmed, they go into a state of hyperarousal. That means the autonomic nervous system gets activated. You might know this as a fight or flight response. It can be extreme or it can be really mild. But either way, when this response is activated, people are less rational, they have less access to the rational part of their brain, and they're less likely to be connected to their empathy. So the last thing I want to mention about shame is that shame is contagious. Shamed people tend to shame others, who shame others, who shame others, and then the toxicity can spread. And in fact, toxic communication itself, which is shaming, is also contagious. Studies have shown that being exposed to just one incident of rude behavior, like reading an insulting email, can cause people to actually reproduce negative behaviors. Just one behavior it takes. Studies have also shown that for every hurtful interaction that we have, it takes at least 5 positive ones to offset the harm to our mood and the drain to our energy. And studies have found that people automatically mimic, this means they reproduce, the facial expressions, the tone, and the posture of others. And people watching this event do as well, as do spectators to the encounter. And when we see people make negative or hurtful expressions, such as frowning, we actually feel angrier ourselves. So toxic communication is contagious. Think about your own experience in your own life. Think about, when you wake up and you get that one email that's not that nice, or you're on the subway and there's people who are being rude to you, or you're walking down the street and people are bumping into you. Think about how that impacts your mood. It takes time to kind of recalibrate and recover from that. It takes positive interactions to offset the negative ones. So just imagine the impact of toxic communication that's expressed not just one-to-one, but by someone who's influencing hundreds or thousands of others, such as when they're on stage or they're posting online. And imagine the increase in such impact when that person is in position of authority. So those of us who are in positions of leadership have a responsibility to be extra careful, to use our influence to offset and not reinforce this toxicity. And everybody in the vegan movement, we are all ambassadors for the movement. We are all in positions of leadership in this movement. We are representing the movement. So here I'm talking about how we communicate with other vegans. That's what this talk is focused on. But it's also important for us to remember that this kind of communication applies to all of our communications. And even when we're only communicating with other vegans, think about non-vegans who are witnessing this communication. What kind of values do we want to be representing to them? What kind of model do we want to be for non-vegan onlookers? So toxic communication is causing an epidemic of suffering in our movement, and it is causing tremendous damage to vegans and vegan organizations and to the movement as a whole. And I'm going to share with you just some of the costs of toxic communication. Now, studies of toxic behaviors, which are mostly communications in the workplace, which are findings that we can easily extrapolate or apply to vegan organizations and the vegan movement, have found that they cause a variety of problems. And I'm going to share some of them with you here. I think. What's happening up there? Okay, you're seeing something different than I am, but you're seeing what I want you to see. And then we can add to this that these same problems are found among the indirect victims of toxic communication. This means the first-hand or second-hand witnesses. So either somebody who has witnessed the communication firsthand, who is standing there, or maybe a friend or a family member that a person talks to about what happened later on in the day. In fact, just one person who engages in toxic behaviors in a group reduces the group's performance by 30 to 40%. Think about that. Imagine taking away 30 or 40% of the energy from the vegan movement. Think about how you feel when you have a conversation with somebody who you want to be vegan and they leave and they're not convinced about veganism being a valuable lifestyle. Darn, that's just one person. You can feel so frustrated about it. 30 to 40%. Imagine taking away that much energy from the movement. The financial costs alone of a toxic workplace, and this is defined as a workplace that has 15% of their employees that are engaging in toxic behaviors, toxic interactions. If you have a staff of 1,000, it costs your organization over $2 million. So we did, my colleague Sebastian and Tobias, I almost said Sebastian, and I did an analysis, and we thought, what does this look like when we apply it to a vegan organization? What do these numbers look like? And so we estimated what the costs would be to a vegan organization. And we concluded that, give or take a few numbers here or there, in an organization of 100 people, toxic communication, a toxic workplace, would be $200,000 in lost productivity. If we had an organization of 10 people, we'd be looking at $20,000 in lost productivity due to toxic communication. And then we thought, okay, well, we looked at what was classified as a, quote, efficient vegan advocacy organization. The assumption is that for $1 can spare one animal. And again, give or take a few cents here or there. And we said, okay, well, what does this translate to into the cost of animals' lives? So in the organization of 10 people, toxic communications, if only 15% of those behaviors are toxic communications, ends up costing 20,000 animals' lives. In the organization of 100 people, that's 200,000 animals that would be killed. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, Melanie, you and Tobias and Sebastian, maybe your analysis was way off. I mean, can you really just apply the numbers from these toxic workplace assessments to vegan organizations? Well, no, this is an imperfect comparison. So let's assume that I'm 80%, which I don't think we are. I actually think the impact is even higher in vegan organizations for a variety of reasons, like the fact that we tend to be underfunded, we tend to have high levels of secondary traumatic stress, we don't get a formal training in leadership, but let's say that my numbers here are 50% too high. That still is 50% too many animals sacrificed for most vegans. An imperfect yet useful analogy can be to think about farmed animals as being in a sinking ship, and their main hope of survival is the lifeboats that are personed by vegans. Vegans who have limited energy because they're already struggling against the powerful tides, the powerful force of veganism, of Carnism. Every toxic communication is like shooting a hole in the bottom of the animal's lifeboat. So we need to take this issue very, very seriously to protect ourselves, to protect our movement, and ultimately to protect the animals who are depending on us to do our job as well as we can. Now, today I'm going to talk about very specific strategies for how to protect ourselves from being the targets of toxic communication and from reducing toxic communication in the movement as a whole. But first, I'm going to talk about where toxic communication comes from, why we have this problem in the first place. There are many reasons for this, and I'm just going to talk about a few of the big ones today. One reason, as most of you are aware, is because most communication is online, and it's a lot easier to be disrespectful of somebody when you don't have to look them in the eye, when you're hiding behind a computer. So, of course, whenever possible, face-to-face communication is always preferable. Ask yourself, especially when you're upset about something or somebody is upset with you, is there any way you can meet them on Skype and see their face if you can't meet them in person to talk about whatever it is that you're not happy about? Another reason is because the broader culture is toxic. There's a toxic emotional and intellectual climate that is pervasive. So this problem of toxic communication is not just a vegan problem. It's a human problem. It's a person problem. Toxic communication has become so normal as to be unremarkable. I am always, not always, but I am often surprised that so many people don't notice interactions that are truly damaging and toxic because they've been so normalized. A third reason is because in the vegan movement, and this is true in other social justice movements as well, but my familiarity is primarily with the vegan movement, we have high rates of trauma. So we live in the midst of a global atrocity, which is Carnism, a global atrocity. This is a mass traumatic event. That's what animal agriculture is. And it is almost impossible not to have a traumatic reaction to this, not to develop some form and some level of what's referred to as STSD. STSD stands for Secondary Traumatic Stress Disorder, which is just like PTSD, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. How many of you know what PTSD is? Okay, so it's like what combat veterans have. Soldiers returning from war, for example, sometimes have PTSD. STSD is just like PTSD, but with one key difference. STSD impacts not the direct victims of violence, but who? The witnesses to the violence. And who is that? That's right, that's us. That's vegans. We witness, we see trauma. We are aware that there is a mass traumatic event going on all around us all the time. We have to see reminders of this every time we walk out the door, when we see trucks of body parts drive by, or we turn on our television or our computer and we see ads for people putting dead animals' bodies into their mouths. When we develop some kind of a traumatic response, which is a normal response, we can develop what I call a trauma narrative. In other words, we start to look at the world as though it's one giant traumatic event with only 3 roles to be played. What are they? One is victim. What's the other? Perpetrator. And if you're not a victim and you're not a perpetrator, what are you? Well, a witness can be either a victim or a perpetrator, or both, depending on what they do, what their experience is. So not exactly witness. Hero. Yeah, hero. So you can be a victim, witness, or hero in a traumatic event. And when we become traumatized, we start to place everybody, including ourselves, into these rigid categories, with little to no room for nuance. So we lose our capacity to appreciate that good people can participate in harmful behaviors and this doesn't make them bad people. We lose our ability to recognize that we can make mistakes. We'll screw up. We can make selfish choices sometimes, and that doesn't make us bad. It doesn't make us perpetrators. One reason, in my opinion, that we have infighting in the vegan movement is because of this trauma narrative, where we assume if you're not a perfect vegan, 100% of the time, perfect activist, well, you're not a victim, you're not an animal, then you must be a perpetrator. If you're not the hero, then you're the bad guy. And we have to be very careful with this mentality, which is causing us a lot of problems and causing us to be very, very hard on ourselves. One of the things that we need to do to reduce the level of trauma that we experience individually and in our movement, because that is key to helping us relate effectively to others, other vegans, non-vegans, and ourselves, is to stop watching the horrible videos, to stop looking at the graphic footage. If you have to do this as part of your job, then you need to do this very, very carefully and be limited about it. But many vegans watch graphic videos over and over again because they believe that they're somehow helping the animals by watching the suffering. The animals do not need a movement of people who are traumatized. They need a movement of healthy, self-connected people. Sometimes vegans say to me, I'm afraid to stop watching because I'm afraid that if I stop watching, if I stop witnessing, I'll stop caring. And if I stop caring, I'll stop being part of the solution. I suggest that you think of your trauma as an entity, as a being that has taken over, that lives inside of you. And this being has a survival instinct. It wants to stay alive. The way your trauma keeps itself alive is by convincing you to feed it with more traumatic material. And I recommend that you not overwitness. Stop watching if you don't have to, and give yourself permission to let your trauma go. And you may find that you come to your activism with even more power and more energy, and certainly with more sustainable energy that keeps you in it for the long haul, and with more of an ability to appreciate nuance so that you can relate to others and yourself in a way that is more likely to recognize our shared humanity, that we're not perfect, and that's okay. In my new book, Beyond Beliefs, I have a whole chapter on trauma among vegans that can be helpful for anybody who's interested. So this toxic culture, broader culture, coupled with the trauma that many of us experience, has led to like a sort of moral perfectionism, whereby we hold others and ourselves to impossible standards. So, like one unexamined or even one selfish choice or statement, and suddenly that makes somebody bad. Suddenly that makes them the enemy. Suddenly we feel ashamed as though something's terribly wrong with us. And the ethos, that means the overarching tone, attitude of the vegan movement and even beyond at this point in time, is that we not only tolerate, but we celebrate this moral perfectionism and toxic communication. Many of us have learned to rally and cheer around those who raise the battle cry of moral righteousness, believing that it's all right to abuse others as long as someone is morally outraged. And studies have shown that we are actually less rational when it comes to assessing the behaviors of angry people. We tend to perceive or see angry people as more believable, more competent, and more intelligent than they actually are. So we celebrate moral outrage, and we don't think critically about people who are morally outraged and righteous. And this makes us less likely to recognize their abusive communication and behaviors for what they are. Now, I want to just briefly differentiate healthy from unhealthy anger here. Anger is often healthy and necessary. Anger is a normal, legitimate, healthy response, emotional response to injustice. There's nothing wrong with feeling angry. We just need to recognize when our anger is unhealthy. Unhealthy anger is anger that is often what's blended. Blended means that we perceive our anger as us. We can't separate ourselves from our anger. We don't think, yeah, a part of me is feeling angry. We think, I am angry. The anger and I are one. And unhealthy anger has the charge of contempt. Now, I don't know how to translate this into any other languages, actually, but it's an important word. Contempt is like anger plus judgment. When we feel contempt, we perceive ourselves as morally superior. When we feel contempt, we are looking at the other as though they are less than. We are looking down on another, as though they are less worthy of moral consideration than we are, as though they are fundamentally less worthy than we are. When we feel contempt, we usually engage in shaming thoughts and shaming behaviors. So we need to be very careful. If we assume that our anger gives us license not to practice basic human decency toward others, then we end up feeding rather than fixing the problem we're seeking to transform. We have to become very careful. And we can see today that many people who genuinely are trying to create a world where power is more balanced and equitable, are doing so by exercising power over others. They're doing so by using the very tools and means that caused the problems they're facing in the first place. So we need to move beyond our moral perfectionism. Actually, I'm sorry, my slides are not lining up, I think, with what you're seeing. They're not. Okay. Let me make one more point, which is not to confuse anger management with what's referred to as tone policing. Now, this is an English phrase, so I don't know. How many of you here have heard this phrase, tone policing, before? A few of you? Tone policing is basically telling people that they should not speak out when they are feeling strong emotions. And that is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about asking people, regardless of what their emotions are, asking people to communicate in a way that is respectful, which everybody needs and deserves. So let me see if this is going to work. Here we go. So we need to move beyond this moral perfectionism. We need to accept that we have inherited a messy world. We were born into a mess. We didn't create the mess. We were born into it. But it's important that we relate to the world the way the world is today, not the way we wish it were. We have to make choices that are different from the choices that we could make if the world were ideal, if the world were better, and learn to live with some of the contradictions, even as we work towards self-growth and social change. So, for example, a lot of vegans talk to me and say, they're really hard on themselves. They're beating themselves up because they have rescued cats, and they feed meat to their rescued cats. And they think, my God, I'm such a hypocrite. What am I going to do? You were born into a mess. In an ideal world, you would never have to make this choice. In an ideal world, you probably wouldn't have cats living in your house. And nobody would be feeding other animals or dead animals. But that's not the world we live in. So we have to accept that because the world is very, very imperfect, we have no choice but to make imperfect decisions. We have to learn to live with these contradictions. This doesn't mean we don't try to keep working toward change. It means we accept the fact that the world is imperfect and accept the fact that we can never be perfect anyway. Perfectionism is an illusion. You can always make something better. So we need to be very careful to stop reproducing this toxic perfectionism and the toxic communications of the dominant culture. And we can do better. We can do better. The vegan movement is supposed to act as a counterpoint to those attitudes that cause suffering rather than alleviating suffering. And so that's what I'm going to discuss now. I'm going to talk about 8 tips to prevent the spread of toxic communication and to protect yourself in the process. Now, when I originally made this presentation, it was I think I had 37 ways, which we don't have time for. So we'll talk about the 8 big ones. So one thing that is really important to do is to just examine yourself and your own behaviors. Many people have inflated or more positive beliefs about how well they treat others. So really be committed to self-reflection and the way they're seen by others. Pay attention as well to the company you keep. Who is around you? How do those people talk to other people? How do those people talk about other people? And are these people who reflect the kind of person you want to be? We become like those we surround ourselves with. Surround yourself with people who practice integrity and who honor dignity. And that will support you in doing the same and protect you from toxic communicators more. Become a critical consumer of what you put into your mind and your heart, just as you are with what you put into and on your body as a vegan. To do this, it's helpful to just notice the signs of toxic communication. So for example, shouting, using all capital letters and multiple exclamation points or one exclamation point. Absolutes. So for example, saying like men do this versus some men do this, because you're not talking about all men, probably. Or, some men use sexist language is accurate. All men use sexist language, probably not so. Pay attention for people who make character assaults, who make comments about others' character, rather than focusing on the behavior. The only thing we can know is what we observe in ourselves or in others. So somebody's saying she's speciesist because she says or does something speciesist. There's a big difference between saying you're a speciesist and that was a speciesist behavior. Even using the term speciesist or carnist is probably not useful in terms of encouraging people to change behavior. Hyperbole, which is making exaggerated claims rather than just sticking to the facts. So for example, saying Joe's malicious statements rather than saying statements Joe made that were experienced as hurtful. We don't know if his statements were malicious. We don't know what his intention was. Malicious means cruel, and cruelty implies intention. Don't try to be a mind reader. Most people believe that they're mind readers, but we're not. Defining reality. We define reality whenever we make ourselves the expert on somebody else's experience. When we say, I know what your motivation is, I know why you did this, I know what you're thinking, I know what you're feeling, I know what you need. You can't know what's going on inside somebody else. So, for example, saying things like, he doesn't care about animals, he's just trying to feed his ego. I hear this about vegans all the time. I have seen more people than I would like to admit who have been devastated, crying, men and women alike, people of all genders in the movement who have had this said about them, when they are some of the people who care more deeply about animals than just about anyone. Making unsubstantiated negative claims. This happens all the time. Somebody makes up a story, maybe they believe that it's true, about somebody else. It's not valid, it's something they believe. This person did something wrong and they post it on Facebook and it spreads everywhere. And it's not actually true. This is like gossip, right? So sharing information that's not true, that hasn't been supported by the facts, but that other people just pick up and believe and run with. A person's reputation can be destroyed. A person's life can be destroyed from doing something like this. And we have a responsibility to be a lot more thoughtful than that. Of course, any communication that suggests that the other is less than or that is shaming. And just a quick note of caution about intellectual or academic critiques. These are often, not always of course, but often they are toxic communications in disguise. They're hidden beneath big words and eloquently expressed analyses. And people don't recognize the demeaning and toxic nature of some of these critiques. There's a way to criticize somebody's work that's constructive and respectful. And that often doesn't happen in the movement and beyond the movement. When we're communicating, we need to, above everything else, commit to creating a healthy process. All communications have two parts. They have the content and the process. The content of a communication is what we are talking about. It's the subject of the communication. So what's the process of the communication? If it's not the what is it? Thank you. The how. I have to just keep you awake. I know you just had a big lunch of carbs. So the content is the how. It's how we are communicating. And the process matters more than the content. Think about a conversation you had last week or last year. Maybe you don't remember anything about the content, but probably you remember how you felt in that conversation. That's the process. When our process is healthy, we can talk about just about anything without arguing. And when our process is unhealthy, we can't talk about anything without arguing. A healthy process has as its goal mutual understanding. The goal of a healthy process is to understand and be understood. I want to understand your thoughts and feelings, and I want you to understand my thoughts and feelings. The goal is not to be right, which means to make the other person what? Wrong. The goal is not to win, which means to make the other person lose. The goal is to connect. And remember, differences are rarely a problem. Our differences in the movement are often our strengths. It's the diversity in the movement that gives us some of the strength that it has. It's how we relate to our differences that matters. And remember that just because somebody's content might be about justice and compassion, it doesn't mean that their process is. We also need to learn to protect our own and others' boundaries. So one thing to do is to hold toxic communicators accountable. Don't be a bystander. Problems happen in the world not because of one or two or a handful of people that are problematic. They happen because of everybody else who turns away, of everybody who doesn't hold them accountable. We need to hold people accountable when they communicate in a toxic way. Don't keep posts on your Facebook. Don't keep comments on your page. If they're demeaning and disrespectful, take them off. Let the person know you will not allow toxic communication on your page. Don't forward it. Tell people if they're communicating in a way that you feel is not respectful and ask them to change. That respectfully, let them know. You can say, this communication is uncomfortable for me, and this is why. Block people who are not willing to communicate differently. And avoid the temptation to read toxic commentary. Toxic commentary has kind of an addictive pull to it. People can feel, they start to want, the more you do it, the more you feel like you can't stop doing it. Notice the addictive nature of toxic commentary. That's addictive to the ego in all of us. It feeds the ego, which is not the part of ourselves that we want to be feeding. So notice that it has an addictive pull and step away from it to the best of your ability. Leave groups that encourage or tolerate toxic communication. These groups would not exist if people didn't give them permission to exist and stay in them. And if you are an event organizer or you do Facebook meetup groups and you're an organizer, keep the people who attend and keep your speakers safe by making it very clear that you require communication to be respectful. We can talk about any of our differences respectfully. It's also important to stay connected to your empathy, as long as you feel safe enough to do that. For some people, it's not a safe feeling. It's up to you to decide this. Empathy is the antidote to contempt. When you start feeling yourself in a position of moral superiority, that's a good indication that you're not connected to your empathy for the other in that moment. Remember that what's in conflict are ideas, or disagreement are ideas and not people. Pause before communicating when you're not happy about something, and it can be a good idea to put a sticky note on your computer to remind yourself that on the other side of that screen is a being, an individual who has feelings that matter to them. And we're going to wrap up in a minute. I know I have to finish in about 5 minutes. Whenever possible, if you're unhappy with somebody, speak to them privately and do not do it publicly. Sometimes we have to have public conversations, but even then we can do this in a respectful way. And be careful not to assume that just because somebody has power, do not assume that having power makes somebody immune to the debilitating effects of shame. People often talk about their bosses or celebrities or public figures or anybody who they feel is in a position of power or privilege as though that individual is not vulnerable to shame. Everybody is. And as I have said multiple times, honor the dignity of others. Be extremely skeptical of anybody who argues that it's ever appropriate to communicate without compassion and respect. I don't know of a single study that supports that argument. In fact, all the evidence that I know is to the contrary. Practicing compassion is not weakness. It is in some ways the greatest strength. And finally, remember our shared bond. As I said before, we live in the midst of a global atrocity. We live in the midst of a collective insanity that we have woken up to. The only person who understands what it is like to be awake to the atrocity, the suffering, and the horror that is happening out there every second of every day is another person who is aware of Carnism, and that's usually another vegan. It is very difficult to live as a vegan in a dominant animal-eating culture. Every day we wake up and we carry this heaviness in our hearts. We carry this awareness in our minds. We work as hard as we can to make the world a better place for others, and often our efforts are invisible, and we're mocked, and we're teased, and we're not taken seriously. We have a sacred bond with other vegans who are the only people who understand what it is like to live in the midst of this animal-eating culture right now. We have to live with this awareness and know that we are probably not going to live to see the end of the suffering, no matter how hard we work. This collective knowing that we share, this collective knowing and this collective caring, this is a sacred bond, and we have to honor that bond because we need our movement to be the safe space it has to be for us, where we can stay inspired to keep working for animal liberation. And we don't get thanked for what we do. Everybody needs appreciation. The animals will never thank us because they can't. They don't even know what we're doing. So we need to be able to know and show this to each other and to thank each other because we're not going to get it from anywhere else. At the moment, we are the primary hope that the animals have. And we need to remember. We need to remember and remind each other that what we're doing matters, that we're making a difference, and that it takes tremendous courage and integrity to wake up every day and live our truth. We have to be there for each other in order to do this. This is what you give to me. This is what keeps me going when I'm feeling the stress of living in this world. What keeps me going is seeing what you do. It's coming and giving talks like this. It's witnessing the amazing caring and the amazing courage it takes to be a pioneer in this social justice movement. So thank each other, honor each other, treat each other with the compassion we want everybody to treat the animals with for our world. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. You're amazing. Thank you so much. So I know we have like 5 minutes because Tobias needs to get set up. But
we have a few minutes if we have questions. Yeah.
We do.
We'll
Okay.
take a couple.
So thank you very much for your speak. I'm a bit moved right now, so I will see if I can formulate myself properly. So this is great hearing a communications talk go deeper than the surface level. So I used to study rhetoric, and we would talk a lot about communications, and we would talk about Martin Luther King, and we say, why was he great? Well, he said, I have a dream 3 times. But we didn't talk about like maybe the fact that he wasn't toxic, that he was in fact a healer. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you are really saying is that we are all very traumatized, not just here, but in the world. And to really not be toxic in our communication requires that we become healed as individuals and persons, and that we become healers as well. So, yeah, if you can give a short answer to how do you become healed beyond what you said, that would be great.
A short answer on how we heal our lives and the world. I appreciate what you're saying, and you actually did speak specifically to what I am trying to communicate here, which is not, again, I don't want to feed this idea anything, feed any perfectionism and think we don't have to be perfectly healed in order to do great work in the world, certainly. But the degree, we need to attend to ourselves. We need to, many vegans, and I have another talk on this, which you can watch at veganadvocacy.org, and I also talk about it in my book. We do need to make a commitment to developing self-awareness and attending to our own needs. Essentially, we need to make our mental, and in my opinion, we need to make our psychological and emotional health our top priority in the world. Not saving animals. And I know that sounds really inflammatory. Let me qualify that. If we don't do that, we will be less effective at trying to help animals. We have a problem with burnout in our movement. As I said, we've been born into an incredibly non-relational, dysfunctional world. And on top of it, we have this awareness of what's happening to animals. And that's a lot to carry. The more that we can, I believe that if everybody in the vegan movement made their psycho-emotional health their top priority, that's the single most impactful and powerful thing we could do for the movement. Because the more healthy we are in this way, and healthy, the more effective we are in terms of our advocacy, in terms of what we model for others in the world, and in terms of our ability to stay in the movement and not burn out. And we're animals too, and we deserve to find peace in our lives.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. It really was very helpful, I think, for everybody. And you mentioned before about the communication online, and that if we notice that things are not going well, to take it either on Skype, webcam, or even in person. And I'm actually a big advocate of this. I've been talking to people about this for years because I've noticed this trend that most issues happen over chat. So how do you, and I've been having these kinds of experiences where people don't want to call, they just keep on chatting, and then if things are going wrong, they either block you, or how do you convince someone to take this on to a webcam call?
I don't think you can convince somebody to do it. You can just be honest and direct and transparent with them and say, I'm not comfortable having this conversation on chat, but I would like to continue having this conversation. Can we please take it somewhere else? And if they don't want to, you reserve the right to communicate in a way that feels healthy to you. And you can choose, you know, a lot of this is about choosing to disengage from communications. There are plenty of people who are not ready to change the way that they communicate for whatever reason. And in that case, you know, if you're doing your part to have a healthy communication and other people are not doing their part, then probably the most effective thing for you to do is to tell them honestly, I can't continue to engage in this correspondence because it doesn't feel good for me, so I'm going to end this now. If you want to take it offline, then I'm happy to do that. If not, I need to take this off, you know, my thread.
Thank you very much for this talk. And I wanted to ask, how do you not become too emotional when speaking to someone who doesn't want to become vegan? Thank you.
How do you not become too emotional when speaking to someone who doesn't want to become vegan? Yeah, I mean, part of it, your frustration is always going to be equal to your expectation. So I don't expect people to become vegan when I talk to them. And I don't expect them to, because most people don't. And that's a realistic expectation, and I don't think it's actually necessary to create widespread change for animals. One-on-one advocacy, getting one person to go vegan at a time, it's useful, but it's not everything that we have in our toolbox. I usually recommend that people become as vegan as possible, not that people go vegan. And then people are usually more open to that. But don't expect it. It's not your job to turn people vegan, even if it's your desire to turn people vegan. And I know Tobias is, are you here? Waiting, getting mad at me for talking till 4 o'clock. Tobias is on at 4, so I want to be mindful and wrap up. Let's not take any more questions. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. After Tobias's talk, we'll be signing books downstairs. Thank you.